But let me tell you this. My experience has shown me that a truck driver who dropped out of school in the 10th grade, who cannot type, doesn't read or write well, can't write, has to print, is a poor candidate for going into court and arguing a court case before a jury, or to make his appeals, or to carry this case forward to the Supreme Court of the United States. Not because he lacks desire, but because he lacks ability. The first thing you've got to do when you have an illiterate is to teach him how to read and write. You've got to motivate him to want to prepare, and you've got to develop in him that killer instinct. Total victory or total defeat. I'm not going to sign probation or parole contracts. If you're going to sentence me to 10 years in jail, I'm going to have my friends writing writs of habeas corpus and sending out news releases. As I've said before, I don't know how many lawsuits it'll take or how many news releases. I just know that 20 citizens in a county asserting law and constitutional rights upon their government officials can compel those government officials to obey the law. Now, let me go on then next to what I call the blue binders. Now, I want to show these to you. Take a good look. We now have this entire videotape course completed and on videotape in 15 cassettes with all of the paperwork that goes with it. And the paperwork with all of the Supreme Court cases is combined in about 3 of these binders. Now, take a look at the thickness. This is a 2-inch binder. A 2-inch binder that probably contains 400 pages. Notice these tab indexes. And if you'll notice in this black book, would you zero in on this for me and take a look at these indexes that I have in here. Take a look in here at these Supreme Court cases. Did you notice when Judge Hallstrom came in and I said, because of Argersinger versus Hamlin, I reached over here and I pulled out, because of my tab index, Argersinger versus Hamlin. I've read Argersinger, and we have here underlined those pertinent sections that every judge will know when the trial of a misdemeanor begins. No imprisonment may be imposed unless he's represented by counsel. See, that isn't my words. That's the Supreme Court of the United States. The driver's license cases, I'm glad you asked me that question. Crandall versus Nevada, Your Honor, when you're arguing a traffic case and the fact that you don't have a driver's license. That's true, I don't have a driver's license. Here's why. Edwards and Smith versus Thompson, etc. Do you see how fast you can do that? When I walk in the courtroom now, I'm 10 times more prepared than I was a year ago before we developed this system of having all of these court cases. Because when you cite Miranda versus Arizona, you should always write the quotation from Miranda right into your brief, because otherwise the judge has to go research Miranda, read the whole 150 cases to find your citation. Never leave it for the judge to go do that kind of work, because people are lazy. You've got to lay it right out for them in spades so that they can't make a mistake. Your Honor, where rights are involved, there can be no rulemaking or legislation that would abrogate them. And that comes from Marbury versus Madison, 6 Cranch 1. And it comes from Miranda versus Arizona, 384 U.S. 436 at page 491, quote, and spell it out and make that dummy read it. And when you're in the courtroom, let me quote that for you, Your Honor. It's from Miranda versus Arizona, decided in 1968 on page 491, quote, and lay it out for him in spades. You'll be amazed at how you can dumbfound. Isn't this what Christ used to constantly do? All of his adversaries were always dumbfounded at his response. He could always quote Scripture. Satan came to him one day and quoted Scripture. So we know Satan can quote Scripture, but Christ could always quote Scripture, couldn't he? You've got to be able to quote law. And let me tell you, friends, I'm no more talented than you are. I don't care if you're a 10th grade dropout. You know, I dropped out of high school also. I've got all of the problems that you factory workers out there have. and I've overcome every one of them. I type 10 words a minute, error-free. People laugh at me and, oh, he types 10 words a minute. Well, I'm sorry that I'm not a more talented typist who can type 120 words a minute or 80, whatever it is people can type. I've heard of some real fast typers. But I can sit at the typewriter, and by golly, I can type out my 10 words a minute, and by golly, if I need to type out a brief, I'll type it out. And if I need to type a motion, I'll type it out. And if I need to research it, I'll research it. Now, I don't remember Almeida Sanchez, but I can whip him right open. And if I can whip him right open, yes, Your Honor, it's Almeida Sanchez versus United States, 413 U.S. 266. Be patient with me. I'm a little slow, sir. It's over here. Yes, sir, it's over here. It's Colonnade Catering Corporation. I remember that one. Ah, yes, here it is. Yeah, in the Colonnade Court, it stressed the long history of federal regulation and taxation on the manufacture and sale of liquor. And the Biswell Court noted the pervasive system of regulation and reporting imposed upon licensed gun dealers. A central difference between those cases, though, Your Honor, and this case today is the same as it was in the Almeida Sanchez case, Your Honor, in that the businessman engaged in such federally licensed and regulated enterprises accepts the burdens as well as the benefits of their trade, whereas this citizen, a natural sovereign under the Hale versus Hinkle doctrine, whereas the petitioner here was not engaged in any regulated or licensed business. The businessman in a regulated industry, in effect, consents to the restrictions placed upon him. But I'm not licensed, and I've never accepted any constraints upon my rights. Now, do you see how you lay that out in the licensing issue? But I have to perceive that you have already read at least these key cases, of which there are a lot of them. You know, there's a lot of these key cases. I probably read 50 cases before I found Almeida Sanchez. You don't need to read the other 49 and discard them. They're right here. But if you're too lazy to read Almeida Sanchez, let me tell you, you're never going to go into a courtroom and argue anything from it. If Christ hadn't been familiar with and hadn't read the Bible, do you think he could quote Isaiah or Moses or Jeremiah or Ezekiel? He could not have quoted the prophets had he not read them. But it wasn't necessary for him to read every particular document that had ever been written on the face of the earth. They had already been selected out. He was there to preach the acceptable time. He was the Messiah. He came with a message. When you walk into the courtroom, ladies and gentlemen, you're walking in with a message. And this is your message. And this message is laid out in these 30 lessons. And here is the paper that goes with them. The total amount is $200 or $250. And you can order as much or as little as you want. If you don't want to order Almeida Sanchez, why don't you fool me? Why don't you cut me off at the pass? Don't let me make a profit off of you. Go to the law library and you go copy Almeida Sanchez. How's that? That way you don't have to sit there and say, well, that Gordon makes a profit off of me and it just irks me. You need Almeida Sanchez and you need Miranda versus Arizona. And if you don't get it from me, then get it somewhere else. I've never said for a minute that I've got any monopoly on the law or any monopoly on any books. I'm simply saying I've spent a lot of time, effort, and energy. I went out and researched it. I put it together. I put it before some good qualified lawyers who have looked at it and said, yeah, that's right. That's the way that works. I've taken it to judges and sat down over lunch and said, what do you think? And they said, yeah, that's right. And it works. I have done it personally, and we've got dozens of students who have now gone into the courts and used this format and used this strategy and have won case after case. Now, if they can do it, you can do it. And another thing that we've said right from the beginning, we don't claim that when you finish the 30 lessons that you're going to be an F. Lee Bailey or a Clarence Darrow. But let me tell you, friend, you're going to be a hell of a lot better than you are today. You're going to be a hell of a lot more qualified to go in there and do battle with that paid professional if you've got some instruction. You know, our U.S. hockey team beat the Russians at the last Olympics, and it was really amazing. Nobody thought that they could do that. And that team, they got together and they went out and they played their heart out and they beat the paid professionals. They beat the F. Lee Baileys. Everybody knows that the Russians have got the best Olympic team in the world. Have for many years, because they train their athletes. They're all paid professionals. And our guys are going in there as amateurs. You know, they're factory workers that run every night. In the Soviet Union, they have runners that only go to the factory to build up their muscles if that's necessary. They run day and night. They're trained and paid and supported, and their wives and families are supported because they're a state operation. And that's exactly what you're facing. Every time a citizen walks into that courtroom, the odds are stacked against him 10-1. And unless the citizen is willing to put forth enough effort, I mean, you've got to put forth some effort, some work. You got to get off your duff. You got to go do something. It's not enough to sit here and talk about the problems. We've got to go do something about the problems. And I want to address, in the few minutes that I've got left on this tape, the reason why Americans are less able to do battle with their government than are other people in the past, such as our founding fathers and such as people like Mahatma Gandhi. When Gandhi began his crusade in the 1920s and 30s in India, I think probably as he began, he did not have a clear idea of what would occur 20 or 30 years down the road. In the same vein, I remember the Battle of Midway. I don't remember it personally, but I can remember reading about it and hearing about it. And after the battle was all over, nobody really knew who won the Battle of Midway, but yet it turned out to be the turning point in World War II in the Pacific. And like any battle or crusade, I'm sure that in 1776, when the Founding Fathers signed the Declaration of Independence, they didn't recognize or realize or foresee the final surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. And in the particular instance that we're talking about here in trying to restore our constitutional government, I'm sure that what we have here in America is this. We have hundreds of groups of people, maybe thousands. People write to us all the time, and I'm sure that we don't know of everybody in the country. But I see a general dissatisfaction in the average man who works in the factory. He's mad at the IRS, he's mad at the policeman, he's not too happy with the way things are, but he doesn't know what to do, he doesn't know how to change it. In the 1960s, we went through a different type of revolution from the revolution of our founding fathers, and I can remember some of the hippies and the yippies and the long hairs of the period, 1968 through 1970 period, when they were really out marching and parading in the streets. And I remember one so well when asked, what is it that you're trying to do? And he wanted to tear down the government, and he wanted to change the governmental process and get out of Vietnam. And after you've accomplished this and you've torn the government down and you've turned us into anarchy, what is it that you want to accomplish? What new program do you have? And he said, well, once we've torn it down and destroyed it, then we'll talk about what we want to do to replace it. I don't think that this is an acceptable alternative, and I don't think that it's reasonable, logical, nor do I think it makes common sense. A lot of blood has to be spilled in a revolution, and we've already fought and won our revolution. We already have our Constitution. We have exactly what our founding fathers set out to accomplish. Now that we, the children of the fathers, have just exactly what they set out to accomplish and they've given it to us, we don't know what to do with it. We've got the wealth and the possessions, and there they are, they're all stacked up, and we're sitting here going, well, now what do we do? We have to use them. The Constitution isn't something that was written 200 years ago that is once settled, always settled. It's like graduating from high school. Did you think you were educated the day you graduated? Probably you did, but by the time you got to be 30, did you recognize that there was still a couple of things in life that maybe you didn't know and hadn't learned yet? And didn't some of you go back to graduate school, or didn't you go to college and take some extra courses, or when you took a job somewhere, didn't you go on and do some specialized study in those particular areas so that you could improve or better yourself? Is it any different with our Constitution? Is it any different with our government? Did you think that once we threw off the tyranny of King George, that all of the tyrants in the world were suddenly put at bay at the end of the bayonet, so to speak, and would never attack and never deprive us of our rights again? The tyrants are always there. The tyrants will always take your rights. What we see today occurring is no different today than it was in 1774, except that we've got so many toys that get in our way, we're unable to accomplish very much for fear that the IRS will put a lien on our bank accounts or take our houses and our cars. And that's why we Americans are so poorly equipped to deal with the tyranny that surrounds us today. The first thing the tyrants did was to surround us with toys. Now the tyrants themselves have indebted us to trillions of dollars that we can never pay off. If we lived to have 10 70-year lifetimes, we could never pay off this kind of debt. And now we don't own our automobiles and our cars and our toys and our motorcycles. We have an equitable interest in the banksters' toys, automobiles, and national debt. We're enslaved to $100 billion a year in interest payments. And we're so fearful that we're going to lose our toys that we're content to go on playing with our toys like a little 6 or 7-year-old kid. Or even worse, when you've got a 3-year-old kid or a 2-year-old kid and you take it away from him, he just sits there and howls. Our founding fathers didn't have that problem because they weren't faced with that kind of materialism. And it reminds me of Gandhi because, you see, those people had nothing to lose. They didn't have anything. And so they were able to go to jail, and they were able to go about the business of throwing the English out of India. And if we are going to throw the tyrants out of our government that have been entrenched now for 75 or 80 years, we have all of the tools we need. We have the law on our side. We just don't have any warriors. We don't have any soldiers who are willing to go into the battle. And in every war there are some casualties. And I don't want to go to jail, and I don't want to be one of the casualties. But I guess like Thomas Paine and James Madison and Monroe and Washington and the thousands of men that took on the king in 1776 through 83, some of those men died, some of them were captured and put to death, some of them went to prison. Gandhi went to prison many times. Alexander Solzhenitsyn went to prison. He lost all of his toys. He worked in a concentration camp. His enemies destroyed him physically. And it reminds me of the time when Christ was walking down the road and this rich man came up to him and he says, "Good master, what is it that I need to do to be saved?" Well, put in today's vernacular, you might ask me, well, what do you think I should do to help in this cause? I think I'd tell you the same thing. Go sell all of your toys and all of your gadgets and get your mind uncluttered so that we can go out and do something constructive, so that we can get more bang for the buck, so that you're not the person who brings a lawsuit against 15 government officials, gets a judgment against you for $300,000 and you can't pay the judgment, and so they come and take all of your houses and your toys and your cars and your playthings. If you don't have any playthings to play with, then your government can't take anything away from you, can they? My government is so frustrated in trying to deal with me. The other day someone served a judgment on me for $500. If you can believe this, our Attorney General, or was it, no, it was our county prosecutor here in Ada County, a public official who was hired and paid for out of tax dollars, had the audacity to file an action against me to collect $500 in lawyers' fees. That ought to tell you something. He's operating in a civil law jurisdiction, treating me under the Hale versus Hinkle doctrine as nothing more than a crummy corporation that can be fined and taxed out of existence at his will. Well, let me tell you, it requires some action on some people's part to change that. I got rid of all my toys. You can't get anything out of me, Mr. Prosecutor. Now, a lot of times people will ask me, well, what is it you're trying to do? Are you a communist trying to overthrow the government? Are you some kind of a racist who's trying to kill all the minorities? What exactly is it, Gordon, that you're trying to accomplish? One of the things that I want back from my government is my gold and silver. I'm tired of being robbed, lied to, and stolen from by the Federal Reserve System. I'm sick of lying, stealing, and cheating from my fellow man. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that dealing in Federal Reserve notes is nothing more than dealing in graven images, idolatry, and furthermore it's theft, because every time I pass one of the damn things to somebody, I'm stealing his substance and giving him a mere promise in return. And I furthermore think that there's a penalty involved in it. And so here in Ada County, Idaho, we are in the process with another 100 to 200 patriots of establishing gold and silver in America. We have decided that we will alter, reform, or abolish our government. And if our Senator McClure and Senator Sims and if our representatives Craig and Hansen in Idaho will not do their part, will not secure for us our gold and silver, we'll do it ourselves. I don't need them. We are going to put gold and silver back on the streets of Boise, Idaho, and if there's only 100 citizens in the entirety of the United States of America who deal in gold and silver, they're going to be right here in Boise, Idaho, because we've decided that we're going to accomplish that. That's a goal, and it's constitutional. Our Constitution absolutely mandates gold and silver at Article 1, Section 10. Number 2, I think it's time that the IRS stop terrorizing wage earners. They're probably in this country, as I, read the paper, etc., see about 20 million union workers, AFL-CIO, and various other workers. There probably isn't 1% of those persons who owe the federal income tax, and it's about time that the IRS began to obey the law as it was set down in Bruce-Shaber, Connor, and Eisner versus Macomber. The income tax law was never designed to be taxed on wages. The income tax law is no new law, so says the Supreme Court. The 16th Amendment added no new taxing powers. Therefore, another goal that I see that needs to be accomplished is the IRS needs to be trained and taught by we the citizens that we are not the taxpayers, that it's the corporations and the privileged people who are the taxpayers, not we the laboring people. Do you know that Scripture says that the wages of a laborer the sun shall not go down until they be paid to him? And yet we have a government that is taxing the very substance of old women and widows and orphans and laboring people. The shame of it ought to be embarrassing. We steal widows' houses and oppress orphans. Another thing that I've noticed on our roads is we've got to get our insurance companies back to the business of assuming risk for those people who want the risk of assumption or the assumption of risk carried by someone else, and to stop terrorizing we the citizens on the highways through traffic tickets and other forms of political and economic terror or terrorizing us for the use of an inalienable right. Our right to travel is guaranteed to us by Magna Carta, not by Mutual of Omaha or some other damn insurance company whose only interest in life is to protect the claims window of the insurance industry. I have a whole lesson on this, and we'll talk about this law enforcement growth industry and this insurance industry. I want my right to travel back. It's an inalienable right, and it's called liberty. I want the return of our grand juries. Our grand juries have inquisitorial powers. Check Hale versus Hinkle. It's a crucial and it's a key case, and our Supreme Court readily recognizes the inquisitorial power of we the citizens when we're dealing with our county, state, and our city officials. We've got to have that power of the grand jury back. When we lost our grand juries, the government became the terror over we the citizens. And I think it's time for us to reclaim our rights to our grand juries. You know, those grand juries will call our county prosecutor in and ask him why it is that he makes certain prosecutions against certain citizens. Why it is that that fox protects the sheriff of Ada County, who is another fox, who protects the commissioners of Ada County, who are 3 more foxes. It's time that the hens threw the foxes out of the hen house, and that we began to control our own destinies through our Constitution and through our rights. It's time that our public officials, in short, began to obey the law. Is it too much to expect our sheriff to obey the statutes, our county prosecutor to be held accountable for the monies and for the prosecutions that he both spends and that he executes? Well, I don't think it is, and I think that when we, the citizens, gave up that power in Ada County, Idaho. We just gave carte blanche to certain public and government officials the license to terrorize us. I want those grand juries back. Common law process. You know, when we have our grand juries back, we can then claim with our gold and silver our rights instead of our equitable interests and privileges. When we stop driving our cars with driver's licenses, we will drive as a matter of right. When we stop accepting the government's privileges and handouts, we will no longer owe that government a duty or a specific performance. You farmers out there that have your soil bank payments coming in and who have your contracts with the Department of Agriculture, your slaves, and unless or until you stop accepting those government privileges, you will owe a government duty. So long as you accept it from the government, you can expect to pay it to the government. And for every $100 you pay to the government, you'll be lucky if you get $10 back. And for those of you that get $200 or $300 or $400 back for every 100 you pay in, I recognize the motivation for your desire to continue the system. But just like every gambler in Reno, for every one that makes $10,000, there were 10,000 who had to lose $2 or $3 each. And I think it's time that we stop doing that. Free men everywhere have got to stop accepting the government's privilege in order for us to reclaim our rights at law. If we want common law due process, then we're going to have to stop accepting the civil law privileges. I think it's time that we began to educate our public servants through the media. We're going to do this. I may not. If I don't, there's 5 more men right behind me that are going to sit right down in this chair and do what I can't do. If need be, I'll go to prison. If need be, I'll die. But one thing is certain. I will not worship their gods and I will not submit to their tyranny. And when there are a few more red-blooded Americans out there that will start to go in and do some work for a change, and I'm not saying that there aren't some people who have done some work, because there's some real patriots that began this in the 1960s when the tax strike movement sure as hell wasn't a very popular endeavor. And I'm not even suggesting that you become a tax protester or join some movement or group, or that you belong to this or that groupie. It's time that Americans began to stand on their own 2 feet like the man in the panhandle of Idaho who single-handedly compelled our governor and our legislature to start obeying the law and to stop gerrymandering our counties. That's the example that I think we need to follow. One citizen by himself has compelled our state legislature and governor to obey the law. And it only takes one of you in Illinois, and one of you in Maine, and one of you in Texas. And if you'll go out and talk to some of your neighbors and educate and train yourselves and go in on the courtroom floor and start bringing these terroristic police departments and government agencies and cut them down to size like we did when we went into the Promised Land. If you've got a 14-foot tall Anakim with cities walled up to heaven, then it's time to hit the bastard in the knee and knock him down to size and cut his head off. And that's the way that's got to be done. And it's got to be done by you. And you're the guy that's got to go out and do it. And if it takes education of our public officials, take a good look at Winnemucca, Nevada. They have a sheriff down there that they can educate and that they can work with. If the people in Winnemucca, Nevada can talk to their sheriff, then you ought to be able to talk to the sheriff in your county. And if your sheriff doesn't want to talk, then why don't you take him in on the courtroom floor and sue him? Why don't you cut him down to size by using Title 18 and Title 42? The next sheriff that takes office will listen to you more intently. And another item that I've contended for is my right to counsel of my choice. I'm sick and tired of the American Bar Association telling me, the citizen, when I'll come in and when I'll go out. I'm not listening to the American Bar Association. I don't have any of your privileges, and I'm not asking for them, nor will I accept them if you offered it to me. And when we get a few more red-blooded, spine-filled Americans who will walk in the courtroom and tell the judge in plain language, I don't know who that guy is, but he doesn't look competent to me. I've brought my friend over here. He's my next friend and neighbor down the road, and he's a farmer, and he can walk and chew gum and talk at the same time. And that's the man that I want to speak for me in this courtroom, and that's the man that I want to assist me to defend these malicious charges. You know, One of the things that I think that our adversaries like to do is to brand us as radicals and extremists. I think it's time that we pointed out to the government, you fools are parading around on horses stark naked, parading off your new clothes. You're not only not wearing new clothes, you're walking around out here or you're riding around on a horse naked. Maybe it takes a wage earner up here in Minnesota, or maybe it takes a housewife over in Louisiana to walk in the courtroom. We have a housewife who's down in Salt Lake City, has won 9 cases, 9 traffic cases, and she's on lesson 9. Maybe that's what it takes. But the public officials in Salt Lake City, Utah, will know that lady's name, and the public officials may lock her up in jail, and they may prosecute her, and they may persecute her. But I talked to her the last time, and she told me that she wasn't going to serve their gods, nor would she submit to their tyranny. And when there's 4 or 5 more down there and 4 or 5 more lawsuits, I'm sure that not only will she have the attention of those public servants, she'll also have that government down there beginning to obey the law. And after all, that's what it's really all about. This trial that I've just described to you here in Lesson 23, 4, 5, and now in Lesson 26, we've gone through the trial procedure to this level of our course of study. We have 4 more lessons to go through, including the appeals process, and to further recognize what our enemies are doing and how we're going to combat them. But it becomes fun. You know, once you get rid of the toys and nobody can take anything away from you, it becomes more interesting. I've got everything to gain and nothing to lose. You know, just like Gandhi, I've got a lot to gain when I throw the British out, and they don't have anything that they can get from me because they've already taken it away from me. And he's reported to have said in a meeting in 1930 that he thought that they would see the wisdom of just leaving India peaceably because it wouldn't be profitable any longer. When it becomes so unprofitable for our government to break the law and to violate our rights, they'll stop. But you know, right now, we've been scattered like sheep. And so the police will pick up one solitary individual on the freeway, and they'll prosecute him by himself. And then they will use his fellow citizens to do the persecution. And this goes on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What do you suppose will happen when they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Title 42 suits? What do you think would happen in Chicago if those housewives that are being brutalized and terrorized by the city and the county police there in strip searches and arrested because their parking lights or their tail lights or they're speeding or something and arrested and hauled off to jail? What do you think would happen if they were faced with 100 or 200 multi-million-dollar lawsuits? Don't you think that those housewives could get the attention of the bureaucracy in Chicago? Let me tell you, not only would they get their attention, they'd have the attention of the entire nation. And they would have the respect of every red-blooded American from coast to coast and border to border. And that's what I want. That's the goal that I'm trying to achieve. There may be 1,000 of these goals. I don't know. I don't know what the issues are down there in Louisiana or Alabama and Mississippi. I don't know what your problems are up in New Hampshire and Connecticut and Boston. You people there are going to have to solve your problems in your own way. But I know how to solve the problems in Ada County, Idaho, and I know how to get my government's attention here in Ada County, Idaho. And I'll recognize very plainly that you people back there in Massachusetts can't do a thing for me here in Idaho. But there's 44 counties in Idaho, and when there's 20 good, competent pro se litigants in our 44 counties of Idaho, we may not elect our public officials, but we'll sure as hell have their attention.